It's been a very productive few days, if you think of it. However, we have yet to overcome the impossible, which is to reconcile, or try to do so, economic liberalism, broadly speaking, to traditional or conservative values. On Monday, I referred to how modern conservatism in the Anglo-Saxon tradition seems to me to share a fairly similar meaning of liberty to that of liberalism, classical liberalism in particular. It is not necessarily bad, but I pointed out that the fact that this is a case seemed to be highly problematic insofar as such a definition was relatively stuck in a negative dimension, as absence of coercion, of government intervention, as freedom from, in essence. A notion of freedom that seems today unable to provide a definition of common goods or any guidance or little guidance regarding identity. Now, as the latter is under siege in light of so many different fronts, such as mass migration, for instance, certain topics we've discussed over these past few days, conservatives across the West are increasingly seeking a more positive meaning of liberty, not just freedom from, but above all, freedom to, which enables them to come up with a definition of the good life and stick to it. Now, because of that, conservatives are also facing a growing, I would say, temptation to not only access power and institutions as they should, but also to capture them, for lack of a better word, and direct them in the pursuit of the notion of the common good. Now, this leads conservatism into a crossroads where there is a clear tension, a growing tension, between liberty and authority, as I said on Monday, a tension that is especially present, I suppose, in economics, where conservatives are increasingly adopting statist policies, and free market capitalism is going out the window because it faces challenges both to the left and now right. As a result, I believe it's worth asking ourselves a few questions, which I hope can motivate an exciting discussion, especially in this already small get-together, during this panel and perhaps over lunch. Now, the first question that we should not overlook is obvious before we jump into today's title, Virtue Economics, which is, should we care about free markets at all? And if so, why? I would make the case that there are intrinsic reasons to say that we should care indeed about free markets. I think there is a moral case for morality economics. Free is better than unfree. There is also an instrumental case for morality in economics. First, because free market capitalism works. That's why conservative politicians like Reagan and Thatcher champion them. It allows also for big tent conservatism, I think, from classical liberalism to the outer layers of the so-called new right. However, over the past decade and a half, perhaps since the 2008 Great Recession, free markets are thought to have failed on a number of issues. They have failed to fulfill its communitarian purposes. They may have served the community in general, on average, but not every member of society, so that some people have been left behind. There has been a growing market concentration in many countries, which has also led to regulatory capture and crony capitalism. The emergence of competing superpowers in the international landscape that break the rules of the game when it comes to free trade, for instance, have also posed the question of whether we can have both free markets domestically and free trade internationally. So in light of all of this, I believe both classical liberals and conservatives must do their best to arrive to a common understanding. I guess free marketeers must strive not only to a free but also to a virtuous society, and conservatives must realize of the danger, both moral and material, of statism. This is where the school of economic thought, New Virtue Economics, comes in, as a fusion of traditional or conservative values with economic liberalism, a school that examines how free markets can promote not only individual wealth, but collective well-being, that shows how free markets need not lead to moral decay, but can actually sustain traditional values. As Professor McCloskey puts it, capitalism can be virtuous if it's embedded in a culture of virtue, practices like prudence, justice, temperance, and love. Michael Novak goes a step further, I think, arguing that capitalism can only work, not only be moral, but can just work under a virtuous society. According to Novak, a free economy is morally sustainable only if it is embedded in a culture of virtue. Without self-restraint, discipline, and public-spiritedness, freedom degenerates into license. Now, this account of economic liberalism is not new. In 1960, in the Humane Economy, Röpke argued that the market must be free, but man must be governed by a moral law higher than that of the market. Hayek, to whom Lorenzo just mentioned, thought of free markets in a similar fashion. And a century before these two, Lord Acton also wrote at great length about the importance of a free but virtuous society. Now, we find ourselves in a similar pickle, but perhaps our need is to reach a swift and favorable agreement on this more rapidly. As classical liberals find themselves, as I just said, surrounded by statists to the left and right. So let us begin the discussion here. Can free markets be reconciled with conservative thoughts, or is it just impossible or too confusing? After all, ideological tribalism is indeed diverse and complex, as are their intellectual forefathers. McCloskey, for instance, has described herself as a literary, quantitative, postmodern, free market, progressive, Episcopalian, Midwestern woman from Boston who was once a man. After all, she was born Donald and lived as a man until age 53. So there's that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Very good. Now, when it comes to citing great men and women, great thinkers around liberalism and philosophy, there's someone you missed out, Juan. It's Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, in his best book, it's a very controversial statement for the Director of Research and Education at the Adam Smith Institute, say, is the theory of moral sentiments. It is, in my opinion, that the theory of moral sentiments is a much more inclusive work, because he does touch a little bit on economics, a little bit on religion, quite a lot on society, and a great deal on psychology. And it was Adam Smith's most interesting insights. It's around the idea of sympathy with your fellow man, fellow woman. And I think that itself embodies the very nature of capitalism that we enjoy today. It is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I mean, one cannot barter or trade if they cannot see why the other person wants their good or service. Now, it is a very good point there, and I think virtue is very much part of that empathy and that sympathy. However, I'm going to attack the motion, if I may, from a left perspective and what we already see as the new virtue economy. That is the idea of selling or forcing virtue. How one would want to describe that usually is from the person who's enforcing it, and placing it down upon free economies and free people. The great proponents of this are people like Jeffrey Sachs, Larry Fink at BlackRock. It's the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are great proponents of this new virtue economy, because to them it seems that there are cracks and problems within societies and cultures that can only be fixed by forcing changes to economic systems. I speak here of stakeholder capitalism, not shareholder capitalism. And one of my big concerns with this, with pushing forward the idea of virtue economics, is that, as Juan has mentioned already, it is already quite apparent that capitalism is a virtuous thing. It is of immense success. You can prove it empirically. You could even prove it deontologically, as Ayn Rand does. But I think if in the wrong hands, the left will really take it and run. And the reason why I say that is from experience. The Conservative government in the UK, for example, decided to have the wonderful idea of banning smoking Now that was seen as and by the way of doing that, it was to do generational age bans. So if you're born on January 1st, 2009 or later, you will never legally be allowed to buy a tobacco product in the United Kingdom again. Now that is seen as very virtuous by our public health gods. Lord Bethel, who's a Conservative peer, saw this as one of the greatest strides of public health, basically since we banned indoor smoking. And for him, it was virtuous in order to secure both the National Health Service, which is seen by itself as a golden calf, which you cannot criticise, but also to secure a productive, healthy society and economy, which, which does not have vice. It is pure Puritanism, it's puritanical. Now, as we know, Rishi Sunak was thrown from number 10 and half his party in July, and it's been picked up again by Labour, who are now going to move towards the ban on smoking. For them, it is even more virtuous to control public health. It is even more virtuous to control individual liberty. It is even more virtuous to control economic activity undertaken freely. And that is my concern with this motion, essentially, is that I think in order to reconcile economic liberalism and conservative values, you open up a really nasty area that could be infiltrated and used to smash on the heads of a free society. The virtues of the left. And I think that is my big concern with this. And it's already started in many ways on the economics side. A question for the audience: who here has heard of B Corp? Few different people have heard of B Corp. B Corp is in the business of selling virtue. Now, what could be more capitalist than selling virtue? It's fantastic. However, whenever you look at a lot of the big products you see nowadays, Coca-Cola may not do it, but a lot of high-value consumer goods, they bring in B Corp to look at the structure of the company and make it more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive, to help reach those UN sustainability goals. And when you review those companies, not much has changed at all, but they keep on pushing. There was a report done, they paid Demos, another think tank in the UK, to really show that a more virtuous company, one which really does integrate EDI and stakeholder capitalism into its structure, performs better. Now, I reviewed this work. What they did is they took all of the portfolio companies of B Corp and they compared it against a hypothetical company. The workings for this I was never able to discover for some reason. And they showed, of course, the ethical, virtuous company performs much more, in a much better fashion. It pays its workers better. It allows its employees to sit on the board of the company. It's got total integration up and down, a very horizontal leadership structure, etc. They perform much better, and this is how we should move. Just so happens that paper ended up in the hands of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party are rumoured to be wanting to change the Companies Act in the UK to move towards that kind of system. So we move from a system which is of the joint stock company, of shareholder capitalism, and by force of government, by fiat, move it through to this stakeholder capitalism, this virtuous capitalism. And that, for me, is that big concern, because it is utilising the power of the state to enforce this ideology on the free economy. And we can show that these companies don't work as well, and yet because policymakers are so convinced by the virtues of this new type of company, we will end up in a better place as a country, as a society, and as an economy. So that is my criticism of this. Now, that isn't totally to say I'm not against including, virtue in capitalism. It should be mentioned and it should be reconciled. Deirdre McCloskey, of course, who's the great proponent of this, writes in her Bourgeois Virtues, her Virtue series, explaining how capitalism came to be generated over that, period from the 1400s to the 1700s, and explains it through a cultural aspect. And a very Christian aspect, Judeo-Christian. And I think there is a lot of merit within that work. She does need an editor, God bless her, because she does repeat, the thesis quite a lot. And they are wonderful to read. But I think it's worthy as an academic text. I just don't think it should be included in such a forthright manner into the current discussions we have around economics, especially when the challenge is people are not listening to us who are in power. And I don't believe that including those Christian values is going to change their mind, to be quite honest. So the question then remains, how do we bring our, I'm a neoliberal, classical liberal, however you want to frame it, how do we bring our conservative partners on board? And I think the answer to that is to show them that it works. And it works well in Christian societies. And it works well in societies that value the rule of law and freedom of speech, and those conservative and liberal values where we already are fused. I think it is continuing to bang the drum for, for the merits and evidence that free market capitalism works. And hopefully they come alongside. And when they push back, they say, oh, well, it may damage the interests here of our country because, we've closed down our manufacturing sector or whatever else. We have to be more lucid and we have to be more convincing in our arguments. I don't think we need to change the foundational idea itself. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to discussing it with the other panelists and you. Thank you.
Just had to do one more quick note. Well, I have two goals today. The first one is to provoke you, every one of you, for one simple reason. I want a good exchange afterwards, a good discussion, a heated one, if possible. So please, let yourself be provoked. I love that. And the second one is, hopefully I succeed with that, to show you a new perspective, especially on virtues, because I think that in many, many cases, virtues nowadays are seen as these kinds of self-sacrificial, self-harm principles, and I think they don't have to be, first of all, and second of all, they shouldn't be, because if they are, in my opinion, they are not virtues, but anti-virtues. So let me start on a basis of an economist that was already mentioned, Deirdre McCloskey. And Deirdre mentions 7 virtues in her work. The first one being prudence, second one temperance, then justice, courage, love, faith, and hope. And I will go over each one of them and just reinterpret them, because I think, unfortunately, I have to do some violence to Deirdre's work, which I respect immensely, I have to say, but still I think there's too much self-harm still in there. And what I want to do is to reinterpret these virtues in a way that embodies strengths, embody self-interest. So let me start with prudence. What is prudence? Well, prudence is nothing more than the ability of foresight, of strategic thinking, of rational calculation on how to best advance one's self-interest. So note that self-interest shouldn't be understood in a materialistic way. It should be more understood in an emotional way, meaning that you try to advance a good feeling, a good emotion, and trying to avoid some bad feeling, bad emotions. And that's all subjective, of course. There's not really an objective element in that. And some people find it problematic. I don't really find it problematic, I have to say. So yeah, prudence is a means of improving one's situation over time. What does this mean in the context of the market? Well, it just means that prudence leads to better decisions over time, not just because people are doing that anyway, but because the market provides a feedback on who makes good decisions, and people are seeing that and are trying to adopt these strategies that the persons who are successful are using and make better decisions in the future as well. So they are learning and imitating successful strategies, which is why this virtue is very important. Then the next one is temperance, and temperance is just a moderating force. It creates a control that is necessary to prevent some impulsive desires from dictating behavior. And what that means in the market context, of course, is that there's a much longer term perspective coming out of that. So not just short-term perspective like politicians often have, but a longer-term perspective, maybe even spanning generations if you have families. And again, of course, because of the market provides feedback, it also creates some feedback that incentivizes people to have a longer-term perspective. Then let's talk about justice. And justice is a tricky one to reinterpret from a purely strength and self-interest perspective. I'm still trying it, but I have to say, I myself am not completely convinced by it. That's just a warning. But, well, what do we need justice for? It is for establishing trust, for cooperation, for social order, essentially. And the virtue of justice is essentially just to inform or transform prevailing notions of justice within a society. What is justice in my opinion? In my opinion, justice is just giving people what they deserve. What do people deserve? Well, that highlights a very interesting point regarding rights, because I think rights ought not be handed down or handed out by the virtue of existence. They should be deserved, they should be earned. And why is this crucially important? Because something you earn, something you worked for, is valued much more. This, for example, is why I think that freedom is in retreat. People don't value it anymore because they don't have to work for it. Give people the need to work for their rights, and they value their rights much, much more. And essentially, if they have to work for rights, this leads to a meritocratic system which essentially has people compete for what they think they deserve. And again, if they fail to get what they think they deserve, they have to adopt other strategies. So that's perfectly good in my opinion. Then we have courage. Courage, in my opinion, is just a force that thrives in the face of uncertainty and of challenge, and it's the ability to confront the unknown, to embrace uncertainty, to embrace risks, and to assert oneself. Yeah, this leads to much more innovation, that leads to much more change, and it can, of course, lead to very high rewards, not only in the material sense, but also in an emotional sense, because you can see how your vision of the world or of a society or of a product even just if it's a product, you can see your vision being created in the world. You aren't just passive, you are an active influence in the world. You shape the world, so to speak. Then there's love. And love can be understood as a kind of relational strength. But this doesn't just go into romantic love. It goes also, what is meant is also the bonds we share with family, with friends, with community. And the person whom we love, I think we are genuinely interested in making that person stronger, better, more capable, not holding them down, diminishing them, exploiting them. So if somebody loves somebody, I think that this creates a deep understanding of what this person needs. And what do we need in the market to create a good product? We need to know what the people need. We just need that information. So if you love other people, you are automatically better in the market as you know what people need. And again, the feedback mechanism works in exactly the same way as in the other areas as well. Yeah, then let's go to hope. Hope, it pushes individuals to just pursue growth and innovation and take action even in the face of adversity, to invest in long-term goals, to overcome obstacles. It fuels creativity, it creates a desire for innovation, and it makes it essential to personal and to societal progress. Because it just pushes boundaries, it creates values, and therefore it creates innovation. And again, if you create innovation, you will get rewarded by the market if the innovation is successful. And you already know the feedback mechanism of the market reinforces that virtue. And lastly, we have faith. Faith, I would say, is a form of both mental and relational strength, for the simple reason that it has two aspects. The first one is the faith in oneself, and the second one is the faith in others. The faith in oneself is rooted in self-reliance, in a sense or belief in one's power to shape one's environment. And faith in others, that relies on strength in other people, in character strength, essentially, so I can trust them. If there's no strength in character, if people are just weak, you can't really trust them, because they will probably betray you in some way or the other. So, in individuals that trust themselves, that have faith in themselves, are much more likely to take some entrepreneurial risks, and faith in others, that allows for long-term relations, business relations, alliances, contracts, stuff like that. So the market just rewards people who have faith in themselves and in other people, but the important thing is the market only rewards people who have faith in people in a non-naive way. Because if you trust people, if you have faith in people naively, the market will probably not reward you that much. So that's something to keep in mind. So what I want to argue now is that I think there are just 4 virtues that are necessary for a functioning free market. And these are strength, authenticity, overcoming, and life affirmation. What do I mean with strength? Sorry, I need some water, I guess, but no water here. Thank you. Well, what is strength? Strength is just these virtues that I have just mentioned. These I would all subsume. Thank you. These I would all subsume under strength. So. Perfect. Okay, then we have authenticity, and authenticity is just living in accordance to one's true selves, to one's true values, to one's desires, rather than conforming to outside pressures. So it's what Thoreau would have called following the beat of your own drummer. That's what authenticity is. It's about embracing our differences and individuality. It creates specialization, and as you probably know, specialization is one of the core it is essentially the core of social cooperation, at least if you follow Mises. And it's also, it creates some differentiation and new and more nuanced and specialized offers on the market. And again, this is rewarded in many cases, which creates a feedback and incentive for people to follow suit, to be authentic. Then we have overcoming. Overcoming, this relates to a crucial misunderstanding, in my opinion, that even most economists live by, namely that the market is something stationary and should be analyzed in that way, you know, the whole balancing models with the break-even points and stuff like that. I would argue that the market is something quite the contrary. The market is a constant process of becoming, of change. It is constant creative destruction, disruption, and transformation going on. This is a process that often hurts, that is always challenging in some ways, and yet it is nothing more than the principle of evolution applied to society. Because people are constantly adapting their behavior in response to the situation that they are in now. They are sowing the seeds of further disruption, of a furtherance of this process. So this process can't really be stopped. And then we have life affirmation. And life affirmation is just saying a wholehearted yes to life, including all sufferance, all chaos, all imperfection. It cultivates a positive, a growth-oriented mindset, and this increases the willingness to undertake some entrepreneurial ventures. So it also creates some perseverance despite setbacks. So this is something that is also very much valued in the market. So these are my 4 virtues, I would argue. This is strength, authenticity, overcoming, and life affirmation. To conclude, let's ask ourselves whether we in Europe are embracing these virtues. Do we value and celebrate strength? Well, I don't think so, unfortunately. In many ways, we are celebrating weakness. We are subsidizing behavior that is a consequence of this weakness, and thereby creating incentives to be weak. The whole victim culture, for example, is just one of the more obvious symptoms of this problem. I think that one of the reasons for the lack of strength in society, I have already mentioned. This is that people don't have to work for the rights anymore. They don't have to deserve something. They just expect to get things. Then, are we living in society where, in a society where people dare to be authentic? And unfortunately, again, I don't really think so. Most people just follow the herd and don't speak their mind for the simple reason that they don't want to get any problems. Because nowadays, if you speak your mind, you probably will get cancelled. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that I love to speak to conservatives, because I've never in my life heard from a conservative, I dislike your opinion and you should be cancelled. I didn't hear that from a conservative. So thank you for that, and please keep it that way. That's important. But yeah, back to speaking one's mind. If people don't even do that, how much less likely is it that they act in an authentic way? I think the chances are next to none. Are we embracing overcoming? Well, just look at all the bureaucratic structures and regulation that is going on. I can't really, in my opinion, it can't really be argued that we really embrace overcoming. It's about holding people back and trying to stop disruption from happening. So, no. Overcoming is also not a virtue we embrace. And lastly, is our society life-affirming? I'll leave that to judge for yourself, but just 2 words to help you out there. Last generation. I don't think there's too much life affirming in there. I think, to conclude, we lost the fight on the virtues that really matter for a free society, for a free market. And that is why a free market currently only operates on the fringes, at the fringes of society. Like, for example, the crypto economy is a very good example of that. In these societies, in these areas, in these fringes, there are still people who embrace these virtues of strength, of authenticity, of overcoming, and of life affirmation, and they are fleeing to these areas for good reason. So if we want to enlarge the scope of the free market again, we have to fight for the right virtues, and we have to win this fight. Thank you.
Shall we take some questions?
It's on now, I think. Good. I enjoyed the presentations very much, and I particularly just want to concentrate on Maxwell's, because he raised this question of the moves against shareholder capitalism, which I think is a very crucial one, and which I think is a matter of one virtue, namely justice, and others. The justice one is, of course, the shareholder capitalism is based upon the idea it is the investors who take the risks. They pay, the banks have a rate of return guaranteed, the workers bargain with their employers for a guaranteed income, and what's left goes to the shareholders. And that's just because they're the people who founded it and they're taking the risks. If you introduce a system in which the stakeholders, and of course it seems to me the concept of stakeholder is like a concertina. It can be expanded or contracted according to taste. That means that the people who are already paid or who are getting their interest will be determining what the shareholders are allowed to keep. I doubt if that is just at all, and I certainly think it is a disincentive to capital investment. Who will benefit from this? Well, obviously, I'm afraid this is another example of the relentless march of the managerial revolution. The managers could go to the banks now, borrow the money, and buy their shareholders out. Why don't they do that? Because they don't want to assume the risks. But what they want to do is to spend the surplus capital, the profits, on their tastes and their interests. Those tastes and interests have often been dictated by people outside the company, like the wife of the CEO, who wants money to go to some favorite charity or cultural event. I think the second, but now a more sinister element is coming into this. Government and its allies in the corporation want to take the shareholders' profits and give them to favored political and social causes. I think that is wrong, and I think if the managers want to do that, they should first buy the company, and then secondly, they can distribute the rewards of the enterprise at will. I think these things are bad. I'm not sure also how the concept, how the stakeholder concept would encourage what we would all like to see, innovation and the growth of the owner enterprises. That is the source, as we know from Elon Musk, of enormous advantages to society, in that these are the people who really make, not solely, but they make a lot of the major innovations. Secondly, they are a force within society for non-establishment points of view, and for the points of view that are not necessarily emerging from the large collectivities in society. And that itself is a virtue. I think I could go on some time now, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll come, as soon as you address me on this, I'll come back on this. What's very concerning, we're seeing this in the UK at the moment, is this idea of stakeholder capitalism is now being included in law. For those of you who aren't aware, there was a judgment in the High Court a couple of weeks ago with the retailer Next. And it was a paid discrimination suit, actually, because the till workers in Next were upset that the people in the warehouses were being paid more. Now, I don't know if anyone has ever worked in a warehouse. I haven't, but I've read enough testimony to say it's pretty back-breaking labour. And it's seeing as my sister used to work in a shop, used to talk to her about it, a little bit more relaxed and sedentary. So the input was different, the demand is different. Shop workers didn't want to go and work in the warehouse because they preferred that, that style of work, and they were paid less for it. They sued Next. The High Court came out and said, this is wrong, they should be paid exactly the same. This is the stakeholder capitalism that we're talking about here. It is people feeling entitled, essentially, to the fruits of others' labour, whether that's within the company structure or even in their interactions with policymakers. We're seeing all these calls for new taxation as well of corporates, and we're about to see capital gains tax go to the highest rate in Europe. So it's a part of a mindset. It's part of this left, statist virtue that is being kind of woven into the fabric of capitalism at the moment. It's very concerning. And John, you're also right to talk about innovation being held back. Now, if a company is willing to, differentiate itself on the marketplace by being, by having a very flat company structure, by paying all of its workers, equally sourcing its coffee from certain places, you're aware of the arguments, they are at liberty to do so. The problem is that other companies, let's say Tesla or SpaceX even, who would have thought 30 years ago that we'd be landing rockets in the middle of the ocean by themselves, right? If they're going to sell on the technological innovation, which we know is better for resource control, it's better for the world, it's better for capitalism, and for, as Martin was saying, the life affirmation point, I think it's pretty cool to see rockets landing by themselves, for example. If you choose to divert resources by force away from innovation and R&D and into this stakeholderism, you are going to hold your economies back, and we will all be worse off for it in the medium to long run.
I'd like to say just a few words on this exchange. So I think we should distinguish. So what you've just described is not strictly speaking stakeholder capitalism. I would distinguish between, so what you described, John, on distributing profits and also expanding the decision-making process, ownership of the company, that's not stakeholder capitalism, that's communism, right? Yes, so stakeholder capitalism, strictly speaking, I'm not that sympathetic with it, but it comes from a more benign view on things, which is that the company should be aware of its surroundings, so to speak, which has always been the case. That's why when I hear social capitalism, to me it's redundant, because capitalism has always been social. I just came from Florence, so the Medici were very much aware of their surroundings, not to get killed for once, but also to make money. So to put some popes in Rome, to come from the spice trade to banking, so they knew this and they were praised for it, to support, to be patronage of the arts, etc. So they knew of this. So in that sense, from a company to see, to be aware of its surroundings and to have an impact in society, I think that's good. That's good for the company. That's good for society. What I would be against is to have it mandated from the states, from government, for that to become a license to operate in the market.
I'm sorry, you are allowed to ask a question in a moment. Just regarding stakeholder capitalism, I think one very interesting point is that in stakeholder capitalism, people are just completely missing the point of unintended consequences. Let me go into one extreme example of this. I guess we all agree that child labor is bad, right? You are probably not saying that child labor is good. Well, if a company now says that they will abolish child labor and everyone has to agree with that, and there should be no work for children anywhere, well, what are the consequences of that? The reason the children are working in some countries is not that they have bad parents, that the parents are just exploiting their children. That's not the point. The point is that this is a decision between either the children are working in that countries or they are starving. Now, what is what comes good out of that if companies are saying, no, we don't want any child labor anymore? There's nothing good coming out of that. Companies that are trying to help children should focus on giving them better opportunities, not taking the one opportunity that they value most, the children and the parents of the children, that is, away from them. That is counterproductive. And this applies to most of what's happening in stakeholder capitalism, in my opinion.
Just to very quickly build on that point, my favorite example of this is South Korea. In the 1950s, well, literally from late 1800s through to about the 1970s, child labor was rampant in South Korea. And does anyone here think child labor is still rampant in South Korea? No, it's one of the most developed, advanced economies in the world. And it's because, and Martin's completely correct on this, Western companies at that time were happy to use child labor. You know, the parents were in the fields, backbreaking labor, growing rice and cabbage and all sorts of stuff. The children were many times in the factories, and then they would divert extra time to education, to quote one, Charles Anthony Linton Blair. And I think what's really horrifying from the West perspective on this is child labor was common, even in the early 1900s, up until, the 1930s onwards. And at that point it stopped. And now it's seen as sort of a savage thing to do, to have child labor. It would be in a developed economy, but a lot of the world is not yet developed. And I think we need to have a more sober view of this. And I think this is one of the very damaging things about this stakeholder capitalism, which is, seeking to enforce Western values and Western prejudices onto economies and countries which are just not at that point of having them.
Said better than I ever could.
Right, thanks, guys. It looks like I have a bit of a tough act to follow with that question, but I'll try my best. We've been talking about a lot of the internal issues with this new kind of virtue economics, but what about for a perfectly liberal economic state? What about the external threats? So I'm thinking of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's climate club he started last year as an example, where he's basically trying to get as many countries together as possible to all agree to impose massive tariffs on certain imports unless certain steps have been taken to make sure they're green. So basically you have a bunch of mostly Western countries getting together to force companies in external markets to obey their sense of what is virtuous or lose access to those markets. And we also see some of that from China as well, in the sense of it will put pressure on companies to obey certain values in terms of certain political situations. I won't go into detail, or potentially lose access to that market. How should states respond? How should companies respond? What do you guys think of this problem?
Well, the main problem, again, is the problem of unintended consequences. If you do that, you make the countries that are most affected poorer. We already see that, by the way, in some cases, and there's an even more damaging regulation coming out of Europe, that is the supply chain regulation, I think it's called, where every company has to make sure that all things that they have in their supply chains have to be ethically produced, things like that. And yeah, if you do that, of course, the most affected will be the poorest people in the world. So how should countries react to that? Well, get rid of that regulation. It's extremely damaging, and politicians don't really get what damage they are doing with that. They don't get it, but they have to. And I think companies should just show vivid examples of what that regulation is doing. Like, for example, taking the workplaces of people that are amongst the poorest in the world because the company can't produce in that country anymore. Things like that. Do that.
This is a case in the UK at the moment. I wrote a paper on this last year. It's called the Social Value Act. Now, any UK people who are familiar with UK legislation probably have never heard of this. It started as a backbench bill that got government support in the coalition years. And what it mandates is that the government supply chain for procurement has to include social value. Now, I challenge anyone to tell me what that is, and secondly, tell me how you measure it. Because I spoke to government officials and they couldn't tell me. I even asked MPs who voted for it, who then forgot about voting for it, and then couldn't tell me about it either. This is now fully within every single supply chain of government procurement, including our nuclear deterrent, Trident. So now Trident needs to undertake social value work, which includes, for example, there's about 30 pages of regulations you have to follow, and then you have to mark your own homework and say you've done it. So very strange. It includes stuff like how much time are you spending volunteering in the local community to promote green issues? How much time are you spending in the local community to combat modern slavery? Now, also, is your data center secure? Do you have your own data center? And that your homework's marked against that. Now, my dad procures to the government. Him and his best mate started a little company called Health 2 Works. Other retailers are, of course, available. And it's two guys in an office coding stuff for the National Health Service in order for their IT systems to work. He has to fill out the same form as Fujitsu, one of a global procurement partner, who has an entire department of 250 people to do social value work. That is unfair. And that it is causing serious headaches amongst micro, small, and medium-sized businesses to compete against large companies. The larger companies have entire websites, microsites devoted towards their social value work. If you're a small business, you don't have the time, you don't have the resources, and you're phased out of the procurement process. And coming straight back to John's point, does this affect innovation? Yes, it does, because if we believe in creative destruction and market forces, if you cannot participate in that economy because of regulation which is completely, not to do with the work you do or the service you provide, you're going to stop innovation. It's one of those pernicious acts that's currently on the books, and again, most politicians have never heard of it. Juan.
Nothing to add to that.
I have a question. I know this is probably a bit weird, maybe more of an outside view, but listening to you guys was quite enlightening, let's say, just see what people think in terms of politics, something I just dabbled into from the outside, let's say. And my question to Maxwell, do you think there could be any other use of integrating religious aspects that can impact economics? You said to just sort of, I hope it's not too inflammatory. No. What I mean by that is, from the beginning, I can't remember who mentions the two basic axioms of conservatism. Culture is upstream from politics and religion is upstream from culture. And for the past few days, I was struggling to understand what does that really mean. And to my understanding, it feels like politics is what's meant to help us interact at, let's say, a physical level. Culture helps us interact at let's say, a psychological level from our heritage and all the things we have there that make us who we are. And religion, in a sense, is meant to encapsulate what's real beyond what we can see. And in the spiritual sort of arena, which is very, I don't think there's any sort of law or culture that can really stifle what the spiritual reality, the effect it can have, So I don't know, maybe that's a bit beyond whatever we were talking here. But I thought, especially talking about virtues, since our culture is rooted in Christianity, and the guys who founded it, the virtues they were talking about, actually, if I can quote Galatians 2:5-22, it says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. It's probably beyond politics, but the idea is that somebody who has the fear of God in them and they practice their relationship with God, the Spirit of God comes inside of them, and these things just emanate. It's like a fruit, something that comes out of them. At a personal level, our interactions would reflect that. And then I think, I don't know, it's just a crazy idea. If there were like Spirit-filled people in politics, this would emanate in economics and society and every other aspect. I don't know if you're familiar with revivals in England, maybe 200 years ago. They radically changed society for a certain amount of time. So back to my question is, how do you think, because you're mentioning that some people were mentioning something about religion to integrate in policy, and you were saying to kind of do away with it just because it might not fit. But I guess the way I see virtues portrayed, they don't really have anything to do with the spiritual aspect, but maybe just some definitions that we're trying to just box ourselves in, you know, in order to appear virtuous. But in reality, the essence is inside. And also, how do you think that can be integrated in economics, let's say?
It's an excellent question, and thank you for asking it. It depends, firstly, whose virtues you want, right? So Aristotle wrote the Nicomachean Ethics. You know, I think it was 7 different virtues. John may correct me on this, but you know, and that actually proliferated throughout the ancient economies, because in many ways the economy is just the outward-facing interactions of individuals in society who do already embody those values. Now, you asked about, you know, will there be, you know, very religious, spiritual people at the top of society and the top of economies? Look at America. America is a very religious society with very religious connotations. You know, it is constitutionally an atheistic state, an atheistic republic, and yet they still have on their bills, God bless the United States. You know, it's still very much. And when I speak to conservatives in America, they're very religious, including the business people, and they really see what they're doing with their enterprises, with their work ethic, as evocations and celebrations of God. Right, so it's already there. My concern was more, you know, these more humanistic values that the state can use. I'm reminded of Marx on this one, right? Marx saw religion as the opiate of the masses. Now, I'm a nicotine user. I think religion can be the nicotine of the masses. I mean, it's a real, you know, it can help you drum out more and can help change the way in which you interact with the economy. Some of the great philanthropists of the 19th and 20th century, my mind immediately goes to Andrew Carnegie, obviously founded the Carnegie Peace Endowment, but said he will not go to the grave with a single penny on his body. He was very generous, very opulent in how he gave back to communities and was very much about supporting civil society. And he used his wealth and fortune to do exactly that and to honor God, I think, you know, in that aspect. So, so again, I don't think it's an issue of embedding religion within economics. I think it's more of an issue of the state doing so. We just did a piece of research at the Adam Smith Institute into Islamic finance. Now, Islamic finance is very interesting. It's one of those get-arounds. How do you charge interest without charging interest? Because obviously that's forbidden. Usury is forbidden in the Quran, and it's forbidden in, you know, I think it's the Old Testament as well. Jesus obviously beating the moneylenders out of the temple it comes to mind on that one. So they have something called shura. Not shura. It's oh God, I've forgotten the name for it now. There is a way in which financing, in the way in which you can structure your finances so that you can get a return on the money you loan whilst it being halal. And you do need accreditation from a spiritual leader or mosque or a council to do so, but it's done entirely out of the purview of the state. This is fantastic, great. This is a new innovation on finance. It really took off in the 1960s and 70s in the Middle East. This is how, you know, religious people can go about doing business whilst also honoring their spiritual commitments. And it's proven immensely popular in the Middle East. It's proving immensely popular in the Far East, in Malaysia and Indonesia. Obviously, Indonesia having the most number of Muslims in a country, and it's taking off in the UK as well. Under the guise, and here's the innovation, under the guise of more ethical capitalism. So some people don't want to be invested in oil, they don't want to invest in weapons, fine. A lot of mainstream banking, unfortunately for them, is invested in these dirty product services. So there are cooperatives that are essentially set up that don't charge interest, give you more control over your finances, and that they are essentially permitted to act in that ethical, that spiritual way. Their main problem, and this is why I wrote the paper, I thought it was very interesting, is they're not licensed to operate as banks because you need a banking license. And the UK does not like issuing new banking licenses. So there are lots of new innovations that come about from that spiritual aspect, that engagement with the economy, and I think that deserves a lot more study.
If I may add something, I think one of the biggest dangers of focusing on religious values, Christian virtues, things like that, I think is that there are some self-harm, some self-sacrificial virtues in Christianity, at least according to the mainstream interpretation, I would call it. And if there is a big risk that leftists, socialists come in afterwards, after we have fought for these self-sacrificial principles, that they come in and outperform us in self-sacrifice and self-harm. I think this could be very damaging for society and for an economy if that happens, and by the way, it happens currently.
But that would be a perversion of a Christian virtue. It wouldn't.
Sorry?
That would be a perverted Christian virtue.
Probably.
Not that. So to your point, totally agree with you. So I think the material flourishing of civilizations goes, hand in hand with the underlying moral principles, and that's why the West has some good things and bad things. But I will make the case that it's better than any other competing civilization, both materially and morally. Right, the greatest degree of economic development, and also the greatest kind of the summit of rights and freedoms. I would say. Now, for some time, the material progress or the flourishing of civilizations can be way higher than the moral foundations when these decay, right? But that progress, that material progress, if so, it doesn't withstand the test of time, and this is what we are seeing today. So Europe, for instance, is not competitive in the world stage, and part of it is because of we've forgotten those moral foundations, and part of it is because of the ungratefulness of their own, meaning us, and also the barbarians always, waiting at the gates. Okay, in this case, competing, superpowers, regions of the world, etc. Now, when it comes to outperforming ourselves, or the left, capturing some Christian virtues and kind of instrumentalizing or weaponizing them, that doesn't mean that the Christian virtue is intrinsically or instrumentally evil or flawed. Okay. It means that virtue and virtue signaling in this case is always prone to capture, and we should also we should remain in that moral stage so that we understand when morality is being perverted. Because, for instance, when it comes to identity politics, so identity politics is based on the notion of victimhood. Well, the only civilization on earth that has ever praised the ultimate victim is Christianity. Across history, what you try to imitate is the powerful, the wealthy, the strong, that's the go-to guy. I want to be like him, right? Christians, however, do quite the opposite. The one that has been humiliated, who has been, who has died naked on a cross, right? So without a Christian kind of ecosystem, these virtue signaling, this identity politics of victimhood would have never, rise, I guess. And it hasn't in other civilizations. So that gives you a hint, okay? But again, that's not the problem of a Christian virtue. That's a problem of, Christians forgetting what the right meaning of those virtues is, I think.
I agree.
Is Herr Nietzsche in the room with us now? You know? Any more questions?
Exhausted.
Exhausted. Juan, you want to wrap up? Do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. Let's go. So when's lunchtime, Robert? 15 minutes? Okay. See each other in lunch. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.